It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Okay, listen, I've been trying to book this show for quite some time. I want to welcome to the show Jake Bernstein. Jake Bernstein is the author of the book Secrecy World, Inside the Panama Papers, Investigation of Illicit Money Networks and the Global Elite. I've been trying to get Jake on the show for months and months and months. He's a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He does a lot of investigative reporting on financial matters and stuff like that. Gets into the real nuts and bolts of money laundering and all this kind of stuff, offshore banking, trusts, all that kind of stuff. The book, Secrecy World, Inside the Panama Papers, Investigation of Illicit Money Networks and Global Elite, has been made into a movie, and he's the writer of the movie, and it's called The Laundromat, and it stars Meryl Streep, Gary Oldman, David Schwimmer, Antonio Banderas, whole slew of A-list actors here, and it's directed by Steven Soderbergh. So here you got something here definitely on the short list for the Academy Award. Jake's done some great work here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Jake, are you there?
Is derived from something illegal, whether it's a bribed payment or drug trafficking or some kind of criminal activity, and then washing that money so it's clean. So one way to do that, for example, would be to use that money to set up a shell company and have that shell company buy an apartment in London or in New York City, all in cash, and then I could park that apartment for a year or so, and then turn around and sell it. And suddenly, the money that I derive from that sale is clean, right? I can point to where it comes from. It comes from the sale of this apartment. So that's one way to sort of clean your money. And shell companies and the anonymity they afford have proven, irresistible and beneficial for the criminal activity. I mean, there's the Treasury Department, I think, estimated that there's something like $300 billion a year of dirty money that's laundered annually just in the United States. So that's not even worldwide, where it's probably closer to 2 trillion. But in the United States alone, it's 300 billion. So there's a huge amount of financial activity, and this offshore system sort of enables that to function.
Well, but if you have money, cash, from illegal sources, how do you get that cash into the bank? Like, I know back in the 80s, you could walk into the bank with a box full of cash, okay, in New York, okay, and it was pretty common. But they passed all kind of laws now. You can't do that anymore. So how does that cash get down to Panama?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's a great story in my book Secrecy World about HSBC, which has been like a bank at the forefront of being used by money launderers and criminals for many years. And in Mexico, I think it was HSBC. The HSBC branch in Mexico was receiving so many boxes of cash as the result of the drug business down there that they actually had to change their teller windows so the boxes could fit through the window. I mean, quite literally, they were boxes of cash. So your comment just made me think of that. In this day and age, you can get your money through all kinds of different ways. You can transfer money by wire. Deutsche Bank, for example, for a long time, and may still has one of the largest wirehouses in the United States. There's billions of dollars that comes through this, and they do not do a particularly good job at checking, the provenance of every bit of that. So, I mean, lawyers have accounts. If I have a lawyer in New York, he has an escrow account. I could wire my money to him, and then he could be the custodian of that and turn around and use that to buy the apartment or the painting or whatever. There's lots of banks that are more than happy to do this kind of business. And in fact, the three most secretive banks in the world right now, or banking countries in the world right now, as designated by the OECD, which is sort of the group of developed nations, is Israel, Switzerland, and Austria. So all of those places are very good at bank secrecy, and you could give them your money. You give a bank in those countries your money, and they would make sure that you could use it without many questions being asked.
Okay, but that's okay. But can you still go to places in New York and do this?
Well, this is an interesting thing, actually. There was a pilot program started. I mean, if we're just talking about apartments, right? Yeah. There was a pilot program started where it required that all cash purchases through limited liability companies of $300,000 or more in 12 metropolitan areas. It originally was 7. It's now 12. And it was originally $500,000, but now it's $300,000. That the title insurance companies have to file a report saying who's the owner of the company and where the money comes from. Now, you can do that. There's still ways around it, right? Yeah. It's only ownership is 25% or more. So you could just divide it among 4 people and then you wouldn't have to report. Or, you can say where the money's coming from and chances are people aren't going to check that, right? So, I mean, you could lie about that, but it certainly has tightened up a little bit on the property front. And ironically, when this pilot program started, right? And it was originally just 7 cities. Now it's 12 in the United States. All cash purchases by anonymous shell companies dropped nationally by 70%. So this was clearly people wanted the anonymity. And what was happening, and it seems clear, was that particularly Chinese and Russians were buying up properties in places like New York and Los Angeles and Miami and Chicago and Boston, San Francisco and Seattle, and places like that. And they were parking cash there. And oftentimes it was the result of bribes or some kind of criminal activity. And that became a little bit less appetizing. But it doesn't have to be an apartment. It can be any asset, right? It could be a boat. It could be a piece of art. It could be, all kinds of things. And there's all kinds. And I talk about it in Secrecy World, which, if you want to learn about money laundering and how to do it, you can read my book, although that's not why I wrote it. But you can have a foreign bank account, in the Bahamas and then that can buy like a car and lease it back to you. I mean, right. There's different ways that you can play the game, to turn dirty money into clean money and to avoid paying taxes.
Right. And the average person should know too, that if you have an account in the Virgin Islands or the Bahamas or Anguilla, you still have a regular card. You have a regular debit card like every other buddy has. You walk around, you use that card,
Well, this is actually fascinating. Yeah. There's a whole chapter in my book about this extraordinary IRS agent named Joe West, who was sort of given the task. He had done a big investigation involving a company in New Jersey, where the owner had tried to hide his activities offshore, and West was very smart, and he really dug in. And he cracked it open and he showed what the guy was doing. And his bosses were so impressed, they asked him to do a research project, figure out, how we can get to Americans who are evading taxes through the offshore system. And he came up with a whole menu of options after doing a fairly detailed investigation. But one of the ones that they arrived on that they actually did was this thing with the debit cards, because people were setting up offshore bank accounts and then using these debit cards to use their money tax free. And what the IRS realized was that all those transactions through Visa and American Express and the others actually came through the United States, right? Because they had sort of computer centers and clearinghouses, and so they could get that information and they began to sort of go after people. But there were all kinds of reasons why. It was a very successful program, and it drove a lot of people to sort of declare their offshore assets in a way that they hadn't before. But it also had some drawbacks, which are, say more about the IRS than anything else. And I talk about that in my book and why the IRS has been so slow and frankly ineffective in clamping down on tax evasion through the offshore system.
Well, that's fascinating. We'll get into that when we come back. And it should be a no-brainer, too, because there's like one company that controls like 80% of all the merchant payment processing, I think, in the world. You know what I mean? So it would be very simple to contact them and establish a working relationship with them, you'd think. But anyway, I think a lot of this stuff, they're looking the other way more than they're really trying. Okay, let's take a commercial break. We're going to be right back with Jake Bernstein, Secrecy World, Inside the Panama Papers, Illicit Money Networks, and the Global Elite. And he says himself that this is like a how-to book on how to launder money. So my audience would really be interested in that. Secrecy World and you can find him at jakebernstein.net as well. And keep an eye out for the book, for the movie, Laundromat with Meryl Streep. And maybe we'll get an invite to the Oscar party with Jake Bernstein. We'll be right back after these messages. Jake, talking about the IRS. Is the IRS really looking after this money?
Yeah. No, there's some reasons, right? It was that there had been a certain Congress to regulate IRS. The IRS is down to something like 9,500 auditors, which is down a third from 2010. The last time the IRS had fewer than 10,000 revenue agents was 1953, right? So they do not have the manpower to do these kinds of investigations, and they're difficult, right? If you're trying to get information from jurisdictions, tax havens that do not give up that information willingly, the reason why, this is their business, this is their financial business is secrecy. And so, in order to maintain that business and be attractive to people who want it, they are reluctant to cough that information up to people to other governments that come calling for it. So it's been the IRS is not really the agents aren't really trained to do this. They have quotas, and this stuff takes practice and takes skill and takes time. And so they generally shy away from it. And there's a lot of bureaucracy in a place like the IRS. And I talk about this in Secrecy World, the chapter I write about this extraordinary IRS agent, Joe West, and all the travails that he went through, just to get people to focus on this and to figure out ways to tackle it. And the thing is this is really like, it's a real penny wise pound foolish thing for the IRS, because if you go after some of the schemes that are used to evade taxes offshore, and you prosecute a few people, a few high profile people, or people within a certain kind of trade association, for example, if there are a lot of doctors who are using different things to avoid paying taxes through the offshore system. If you prosecuted 5 or 6 doctors, right, and went after them, believe me, all the other doctors would figure it out really quickly, and they would all come running to the IRS and saying, "We're not going to do this anymore. Give us a break. We're coming clean." So you can get huge impact for limited amounts of work and resources, but the IRS has just not really adopted that. That approach. Instead, they spend a lot of time going after, relatively little money, people who are just trying to earn a living, the mother who's taking in a couple of kids and running a home daycare, really, is that where you're going to put your resources? That's not where the money is. But that unfortunately has been the IRS approach.
I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, I couldn't. They'll like you said, they'll go over they'll go after the mom and pop. But these are civil servants, they just want to get through the day, and they don't have a department to go after Walmart, and all the money Walmart's hiding. And who at this job at the IRS is going to wake up one day and say, well, I'm going to take on Walmart, Yeah. And unfortunately, those companies are rewarded for their tax evasion. Right.
So for example, Apple stashed $252 billion offshore. Now it's such an astounding amount. Apple had an entire department that was just taking care of this $252 billion, investing it and just, imagine, such a huge pot of money. And they were just waiting for Congress to come and say, you know what? You don't have to repatriate that at 30 or 35%. We're going to cut that down, and now you can repatriate it at 12 or 15, right? Or even less. And they just were holding out for that. And Congress came through and passed this giveaway, and now presumably Apple will bring some of that money back. But, they are essentially being rewarded for evading taxes for many, many years. And if you're a big corporation, you can do that. And that's one of the things that I get at in Secrecy World is that this financial superhighway that this offshore system allows, through which all this criminal money goes, is kept open and kept running primarily because of corporations. They're the ones that really benefit from the tax havens and from this wide scale tax avoidance that's going on. And they're the ones that have the biggest stake in keeping this system in place and going forward. And that's the political power that keeps it intact.
So it's not just the drug dealers, it's not the smugglers, it's not the criminals, it's Walmart. Who's the other guy you mentioned? Apple,
Nike. I mean, you name any big company and, JetBlue, whatever, you'll see, that they're using offshore tax havens as part of their strategy to avoid paying taxes. The other thing that I think most of your listeners might not realize is that probably one of, if not the largest tax haven in the world, is the United States. And this is sort of like a dirty little secret. And it's one of the reasons why places like the British Virgin Islands or the Caymans or the Seychelles, get very upset when people, call them out for being tax havens, particularly when it's coming from the United States. Because, Delaware, the Treasury Department and the Justice Department have complained for years that Delaware anonymous shell companies are being used by transnational gangs, by Russian mafia, by all kinds of bad actors. And because Delaware deliberately avoids keeping any records or allowing people to know who's behind these companies, we can't get at them. And you can't blame Delaware, right? Because they make $1 billion a year from their corporate registry. So that's a huge amount of Delaware's, this teeny state's revenue is coming from this business. And that's why they do it. But because of Delaware and Nevada and Wyoming and a few other states, the United States is a major player in this offshore system.
Yeah, I'm from Nevada. And I'm originally from New York, but I'm from Nevada now. And for $300, you contact the company, they set up a corporation for you. They have a nominee service where they're the president of the corporation for you. They appoint you as a vice president, and you can go, and then you do what's that called, an articles of incorporation? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
A statement, saying, okay, we need to have a bank account, and we're going to put Ed Opperman in charge of his bank account. And you go down to the bank, you have a bank, and also the state of Nevada can't talk to the federal government about any kind of income you're making. They don't talk to the federal government because there's no, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Mossack Fonseca had an office in Las Vegas, and they pitched Nevada to their clients in Latin America in particular, and part of their pitch was, it's a first world country,
right?
They've got everything works. And Nevada won't talk to the federal government. And most importantly, people don't think of Nevada as a tax haven. So if you have an offshore company that's based in Nevada, they'll think it's more legitimate than if it was, say, based in the British Virgin Islands. And that was part of their selling point in selling their Nevada companies worldwide.
Well, then why would anybody in their right mind go to Anguilla, which can over, who knows what's going on down there? Why would you risk that when you can keep the money here in the States?
Well, here's the thing, right?
Yeah.
If you're an American, just because you have a company, an anonymous shell company in Delaware or in Nevada, legally, you still have to report your income to the federal government. You might be able to use those states to avoid paying state taxes. But if you're you have to pay your federal taxes, right? It's easier probably if you're in the British Virgin Islands to sidestep that a little bit. So that's part of it. And then I think people are just afraid, right? They're afraid that even though Nevada is not supposed to, talk to the U.S. government about this stuff, that it will anyway, right? So it's just a little bit too close to Uncle Sam. I think is part of it. But you're right. I mean, the Russians and others have been using Delaware companies for years. So clearly they see the benefit and have been taking advantage of it.
Is there any way to plug these leaks that the U.S. government could plug this up and get this tax money to tax the rich, tax the 1%, and or there's no motivation for that?
It's an excellent question, and I keep on coming back to something that President Obama said when our stories came out on the Panama Papers in 2016. He held a press conference, and he said something that has just stayed with me. He said, we're never going to cut off illicit flows altogether, but we shouldn't make it easy. And that's what we've done. Is we've made it easy, and I think that we could make it much harder. There could be more transparency. We could do automatic information exchanges with other countries. We could force Delaware and Nevada and other places to collect more information. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you could do, all kinds of fixes. And there are bipartisan bills out there to do them. But as you can imagine, there are powerful interests with the bankers and the lawyers and the accountants who don't want the system changed. And so they have fought hard against it. But yeah, there are fixes that will make it better. Now, are you going to get rid of it altogether? No, of course not. But if you invested some money and forced some transparency on some of the actors, things would change. I mean, back when one of the wonderful things about Mossack Fonseca is that we were looking at 30 plus years of business in these files, right? Wow. I mean, they started in the mid 80s. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote Secrecy World, is that you can really see excuse me. You can really see how this system evolved over time. When Mossack Fonseca started, it was really just as easy as you opened up a company and then you stuck the information in a file and you forgot about it for a year until it was time to invoice the client for a renewal. And the company was usually created by a bank or a lawyer or an accountant, and you didn't know who was behind it and you didn't care and you didn't want to ask. Well, that's changed. There are now increasingly more vetting requirements and things that you have to do. And in fact, if you want real secrecy, the bar to entry is higher. I mean, it probably only makes sense if you want like absolute secrecy for you to have maybe $50 million or more going in. It didn't used to be like that. In fact, Mossack Fonseca, what they were trying to do was they kind of saw themselves as the McDonald's of the offshore world. They wanted to make this accessible to everybody, to the middle class. With disastrous results for them. But so there are things that could be done to tighten this up and make it more difficult and more transparent if we had the political will to do it.
Now, in your research into all this, because it seems to me, if I'm opening up an account down in Panama or the Cayman Islands or something, you go in there, you open up the account. Oops, I got hit by a car as I leave the place. What happens to all that money? You know what I mean? Ever run into something like that where people disappear after opening one of these accounts?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, here's another interesting one, right?
And that's the business. That's the business to get into, man.
This is quite interesting, right? Because so with more vetting requirements, one of the things that we see starting to happen is you have fake owners,
right?
Right. So you have what Mossack Fonseca offered, and many of these companies, these firms that create these companies offer are nominees, right? So basically, you have they offer you a director, Marta Perez, and Marta Perez is the director of 10,000 companies, right? She's just basically a signature, but it's another wall to get past. It's another way. But eventually, you might be forced to reveal who the beneficial owner of that company is, right? For which Marta Perez is the director. Well, one way to get around that is to create a fake beneficial owner, right? So when you finally have to cough up the information, yes, I'll tell you who the company is really owned by. It's actually just another figurehead.
Right.
It's another fake. Well, the problem becomes, what if the real owner dies? Then you have someone who owns the company, but he's not really the owner of the company. I mean, usually you would have like a legal side agreement with that person so that the real owner's heirs could then come in and say, no, in fact, it's not true. We actually own the company, not the guy who we say owns the company. But it becomes this whole mess. And we did see some examples of that and some fears about that. So yes, it becomes an issue. And then, of course, the bigger issue is if it's illegal, if you're using these companies, for illegal purposes, if something happens to you, you might not be willing to chase after that money because it could be incriminating in some way. But yeah, it becomes thorny. And believe me, there are lots of lawyers and accountants who spend a lot of time thinking about this.
Did you ever run into that danger as well with limited trusts? Because it seems to be the same issue.
Yes. I mean, the trust issue is I mean, I think one of the tax justice group or one of those advocacy groups, calls them, something like the limited trusts of destruction or something, because there are lots of layers, and they supposedly you have someone who is the front person for that, but then you have to have that ironclad, and those trusts have not been as impervious to legal assault as they have in the past. There's been cracks in that foundation, and part of that, and part of the answer to that, or the way they've dealt with that is foundations have become big, right?
Right.
So foundations allow you to have a lot of the benefits of the trust, but more control, and less. There's less danger of losing the control of it, because ostensibly with a trust, you're not supposed to control the assets, right? You're supposed to give it to someone who's controlling the assets for you. And with a foundation, you kind of have the best of both worlds. And Panama sort of picked it up from Liechtenstein, which was the king of foundations, and they started their whole foundation thing. And I talk about this, the changes in secrecy world with trusts and foundations, but the real big players will have all of these things and more, right? You'll have a foundation that will own a trust, that will own a company. There'll be layer after layer after layer, and it'll become absolutely impossible for anyone to track the money.
Yeah, it would be more expensive to track the money than the money you're hunting for.
Right. Yeah. I mean, unless it really depends on the amount of money at stake. But yeah, it's a real problem.
Okay, good time to take another commercial break. We are with Jake Bernstein, jakebernstein.net. The book is called Secrecy World, Inside the Panama Papers, Illicit Money Networks, and the Global Elite. This is great stuff. This is the kind of stuff I love, and I know my audience loves this stuff as well, too. We get into all that little nerdy stuff, unfortunately. And the movie to take a look out for is The Laundromat. So buy the book first, Secrecy World, and then bring the book with you to The Laundromat. We'll be right back with more of Jake Bernstein right after these messages. Jake, when I first heard about the Panama Papers, I started seeing this article come out that one of the investigators, one of the journalists, had a suspicious death. Is that true, or what's going on with that?
Yes. There was a blogger in Malta, a political blogger named Daphne Caruana Galicia. And one of the many things that's interesting about Daphne is that her son was a staffer of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. He was a data journalist, or is a data journalist. And so he was part of the project. Daphne was not part of the project, but she was covering the same area. So she was looking at political corruption in Malta, and it's a real problem in that country. It's a real hub for money laundering and bad behavior, and the political class is very much implicated in it. And so she actually ended up breaking some stuff from the leak and from Mossack Fonseca before everyone else, just by her own reporting. She was that good. And then about a year after the first wave of stories, she went out to her car to go to the bank and turned on the ignition, and the car exploded. So it was a car bomb. They arrested the three people who were directly involved in it. The people who allegedly have put the bomb under the car and set it off. But nobody in Malta believes that they were the intellectual authors. They were just some local, hoods. And so someone actually ordered her death. And it seems more than likely that it was the result of her journalism, and that it was such a public assassination. Really sort of sent a message, I think, to all the investigative journalists who were involved in the project. This was a real concern for a lot of the participants, even before Daphne's assassination. There were a number of people, for example, the journalists in Ecuador and the journalists in Panama, who did not publish their stories under their own names. The stories didn't have bylines because the reporters were genuinely worried about their own safety or about the being harassed via the legal system. So it's the Russian journalists, for example. I mean, one of the stories that I wrote for the original Panama Papers investigation was about Russia. We found, and there's a whole chapter about this in Secrecy World. We found the best evidence to date, really, of how the illicit money operates around Vladimir Putin. His whole group of cronies and perhaps himself as well. We found a whole network of companies that had been created by a bank that the U.S. Treasury Department says is the personal bank of Vladimir Putin. So the Russian reporters who actually worked on the project run tremendous risk. One of the main reporters, he goes to work a different way every single day. Because he is so cognizant that he could be killed at any time. It's a very sensitive issue. So it really varies from country to country, but there are real risks that come with this kind of investigative reporting because you're going after the very powerful and you are revealing their most precious secrets, which is how they steal and hide their money.
Yeah, this stuff is no joke, that's for sure. Now, what about yourself? Any veiled threats, any kind of legal intimidation?
No, I mean, we're fairly lucky in the United States. My website was attacked, stuff like that. But by and large, there haven't been any kind of repercussions that are comparable to the stuff that my colleagues have experienced in other countries. To give you a sense of the seriousness, particularly with Russia, so we sent questions to the Kremlin, before we published our story, obviously asking for their perspective on this. And the Kremlin decided to do something that I had never actually experienced before in all my years of journalism. They held a press conference where they denounced our story before even seeing it, just based on the questions. And so they were very, very angry. And according to U.S. intelligence sources, one of the reasons why the Russians decided to attack our political system in 2016 with their whole cyber operation and how extensive it was, in part was because Putin was so angry that we had published information about the money movements around him. I mean, we saw more than $2 billion flowing through these companies connected to Vladimir Putin. It was extraordinary. I mean, I won my first Pulitzer writing about collateralized debt obligations, which are some of the most complex and confusing things you can possibly imagine. And the Russian schemes were even more complex than that.
What is Putin's estimated worth?
Well, that's a darn good question. So, I mean, it's hard to get a good figure on it. But many people believe that he is one of, if not the wealthiest person on the planet. Now, obviously, officially, he just gets this very small presidential salary. He owns a tiny little flat and a couple of cars, and that's it, right? But he then shows up wearing, $300,000 watches and, dressed in really fancy clothes. And then there are all of these like palaces that he owns and yachts and things like that. So, it's clear that he's got a massive amount of money. And one of the things that we see in the Panama Papers is you can begin to see how that elite group of oligarchs around Putin, including Putin himself, have begun to transfer their money to the next generation, to their children. And this, in a way, is sort of the money laundering, right? They're taking money that they probably should not have, they have stolen in one way or another, and they are legitimizing it by giving it to their kids.
Yeah, something we just saw in the New York Times just did a great expose on the Trump family.
Yes, not too dissimilar.
Yeah, well, I think that's where he takes his cue from. I think he's watching and learning. What about your experience with the laundromat? What can you tell us about that? That must be something, right?
I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
I can't remember a bigger collection of talent. You have Steven Soderbergh, who's just an amazing director. Has done Traffic, has done the Ocean 11 movies, has done just all kinds of amazing stuff in his career. The screenwriter is Scott Burns, who's done a bunch of movies with Soderbergh, including Contagion and The Informant. He's also worked on one of the Bourne movies. He's just done a lot of really, really good stuff. And then the cast, which is Meryl Streep and Gary Oldman and Antonio Banderas and Jeffrey Wright. I mean, the talent is amazing. And I think that, you sort of alluded to this topic can be dry and it can be wonky at times. And if you read my book, I think I've tried to avoid that, although it is maybe a little dense. It's got a lot of information and facts in it, but it's also fun and got a lot of interesting characters. But this movie will not be dry. This movie will be a lot of fun. I guarantee that. So it's going to be great. I suspect it'll be out sometime, probably in summer or fall of 2019. And it's being done by Netflix, and it just should be a real treat.
Yeah, it's a perfect time. People can get the book first, Secrecy World, and then go see the movie early in the year. What about we were talking a little bit off the air about Vice. So you wrote a book about Dick Cheney as well, and that's coming out. There's a film coming out about that as well.
I did. I wrote a biography, or co-wrote a biography of Dick Cheney in 2006 called Vice, Dick Cheney and the Hijacking of the American Presidency. And Dick Cheney is a fascinating character. He had a real impact on the American government for almost 40 years. He was the youngest chief of staff in our nation's history.
Jerry Ford, yeah.
Right. And then all the way up until his vice presidency. And so there's a movie coming out with Christian Bale starring as Dick Cheney. And it's also called Vice. It's coming out, I think, around Christmas time, actually. And it should be great fun. It's being done by Adam McKay, who is the director who did the Big Short most recently.
Okay.
And I think they should have an interesting take on it. Oddly enough, I came across evidence of Dick Cheney in the Panama Papers as well, and I write about this in Secrecy World. In the mid-1990s, Dick Cheney and his wife Lynn did a series of Wyoming real estate transactions with a shell company called Jura Nominees S.A., which, according to notarized Teton County documents, was based in the British Virgin Islands. Well, I looked, and this company does not exist in the British Virgin Islands public registry. It's just not there, even though it's in these Wyoming documents as existing. But what I did find is a company that was created by Mossack Fonseca of the same name based in Panama. And interestingly enough, so the Cheneys used this company both to buy residential property and also to sell residential property. And on these real estate documents in Wyoming, the director of this Jura Nominees, this shell company supposedly based in the British Virgin Islands, for which I could find no evidence, was a Geneva-based attorney who was one of Mossack Fonseca's oldest clients. So there was something going on here that was very suspicious, and definitely, it's probably past the statute of limitations, but sort of spoke to the fact that Cheney and his wife Lynn were no stranger to the offshore system, which should not be a surprise given the fact that they were such big political players and that they had so much money.
He seems like he's on the up and up. I tell you, I'm really surprised to hear this. Jake Bernstein, listen, that book is called, by the way, Vice, Dick Cheney and the Hijacking of the American Presidency. I'm going to start bugging Jake right now to come back and do a whole show on that. Jake, listen, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this, and I really appreciate you coming back, even though I screwed up the first time.
No, it was my pleasure, Ed. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Jake Bernstein, JakeBernstein.net, and a couple of great books here. Vice, Dick Cheney and the Hijacking of the American Presidency, and also, too, don't forget Secrecy World. Computer slow. So Secrecy World Inside the Panama Papers, Illicit Money Networks and the Global Elite, and look out for The Laundromat with Meryl Streep. Jake Bernstein, thank you so much.
No, thank you. And just one thing, Ed, you can also find me on Twitter at Jake_Bernstein.
Okay, Jake_Bernstein on Twitter. Thank you so much, Jake.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Take care.
Good night.
Bye.